and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Celia Strzemska. I'm filling in for your usual host, Don Arlev, just for today. Tonight we're going to take a closer look at the latest military and political developments in Ukraine, including the recent government reshuffle. While Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region has so far failed to influence the Russian offensive in the Pokrovsk region, it appears to have had an impact on Russian gas exports to Europe. Reuters analysts report that natural gas exports to Europe have decreased by more than 2% compared to August of 2023.
Last month's decrease is the first since the record surge in 2023. The Kursk region is a crucial shipping point for natural gas transfers to the central and eastern regions of Russia. This downward trend is related to the significant 28.5% decrease in Russian gas transit via Ukraine. Ukraine's existing gas transit agreement with Russia expires at the end of 2024, and Kiev has no intention of extending it. Ukraine's Naftogaz CEO Oleksiy Chernyshov has emphasized that Ukraine's gas storage facilities are available for EU use to prepare for winter heating season, despite ongoing Russian attacks on the country's energy infrastructure.
On Thursday, the US charged 5 Russian military officers with conducting cyber attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure in weeks leading to the invasion. Members of Russian military intelligence agency, GRU, were reportedly engaged in a cyber campaign against Ukraine dubbed Whispergate.
An FBI agent with knowledge of the case referred to the cyber attacks, which took place in January 2022, as the first shots of war. The campaign intended to cripple Ukraine's government and critical infrastructure by targeting financial systems, emergency services, healthcare and schools. The attacks also extended to NATO members, including the US. This revelation came just a day after US Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the seizure of 32 internet domains used by Russia to spread disinformation on social media outlets. The US Treasury and State Departments also took action against Russian media outlet RT for attempting to influence the 2024 presidential election.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited Germany on Friday, where he attended the meeting of Allied defense ministers at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany. After a week of intense Russian shelling, receiving the permission to strike Russian air bases with Western weapons was high on Kyiv's agenda.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy expressed his gratitude for the Allies' aid and once again stressed Ukraine's need for greater air defense and long-range strike capacity. The Ukrainian president also called on allies to deliver all the military equipment that has been agreed upon. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin praised Ukraine's Kursk offensive as an effort to seize the initiative on the battlefield and pledged a further $250 million security assistance package. Zelenskyy also met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. Despite the ongoing discussion regarding cuts in Germany's support for Ukraine, Berlin has pledged to deliver 12 additional howitzers.
So now let's take a look at what's happening on the ground, and we're starting with Kursk. So the Kursk offensive started a month ago, as you surely recall, on August 6th. And Kyiv says that it has captured an estimated 1,300 square kilometers of territory as of now and dozens of settlements. So why is this offensive so important? According to Ukrainian officials, the offensive was a part of a strategy to slow Russia's advance towards Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine. In a recent statement, Oleksandr Syrskyi said Ukraine was doing everything possible not to lose Pokrovsk. Right, so now let's move on to the Pokrovsk region. Here, Russian forces are conducting intensified operations southwest and west of Donetsk. One can see intensified Russian efforts to exploit gains in the Pokrovsk direction. So, Russian forces intensified offensive operations near Vuhledar shortly after starting to widen the southern flank of Pokrovsk, suggesting that Russian forces intend to conduct mutually reinforcing offensive operations along the southern flank. So, still the Russians have reportedly advanced to the outskirts of Hirnik. You can see that on the map. And the seizure of these towns would allow Russian forces to assault Kurakhove, a significant Ukrainian defensive node for the front west and southwest of Donetsk city. So this is what's happening on the ground as of now. And now here's a brief look at the humanitarian tragedy that the Ukrainian population was subjected to this week as a result of Russian missile attacks. And now it's time to take a look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist. And for that, we're joined by our correspondent, Oz Katerji from Kyiv. Hello, Oz.
Good evening.
So Zelenskyy today is in Germany. Can you please perhaps elaborate on that?
Yes, at the end of the week, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has visited Germany for the Ramstein summit. These are regular meetings between Ukraine's allies and Ukraine to help better provide for Ukraine during the war. And the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was there. And it's the same old story that we've been hearing for the past few months, really. Ukraine is still insisting on being given permission by Washington to strike targets deep inside Russia, with the Americans pushing back on that. Lloyd Austin claiming that many of the assets Ukraine is seeking to strike have now been moved further back. I'm not sure that really answers Ukraine's question, particularly given the sort of bombings that Ukraine has seen this week alone, to show that those long-range missiles could be coming in handy when trying to deal with some of the aerial threat coming from Russia right now. So again, Zelensky's not happy with this. He spoke today, addressed the conference, saying Russia's attempts to draw red lines simply don't work. And again, pushing forward on this idea of long-range missiles. Austin said something else interesting. He said no one weapon will turn the tide for Ukraine. So, you know, they have been mulling sending these air-to-surface long-range missiles that Ukraine could use with some of its airframes, perhaps the new F-16s. However, you know, again, the Americans pushing back on this idea that by giving the Ukrainians what they're asking for, it will help Ukraine significantly in the short or long term. But I think really this is for the Ukrainians to decide. Well, that's certainly the way they feel about it. So this is the way this Ramstein meeting has played out, with the Ukrainians insisting on being given this permission, but they're still holding firm in Washington that they do not want to see their long-range cruise missiles being used by Ukraine deep into Russian territory.
Still, both the UK and Germany pledged more weapons for Kyiv. But I wanted to ask you about the difference between pledging and delivering, right? But why is this disconnect is there, right? So why is it happening, and what is slowing this down?
Well, lots to unpack there. Well, for example, when you talked about delivering and pledging, Zelenskyy spoke today about the air defenses that have been pledged to Ukraine, but not yet delivered, saying they are significant, the amount of air defense capabilities they've been promised, but not yet delivered, to show that announcing that you're delivering these weapons to Ukraine is one thing, but actually getting them onto the battlefield is another. And that's something that Kyiv has not been particularly happy with. But yes, another thing, the US has now pledged in this meeting a further $250 million US dollars on top of some smaller aid packages announced by the Germans and by Canada. So look, these will be helpful for Ukraine. But what really Ukraine has been hoping to get out of the recent bout of diplomacy, particularly in this meeting, particularly in the recent visit to Washington not so long ago, was the desire to be able to strike Russian targets inside Russia. And that still has not been forthcoming from Washington. So that really is the big thing. But again, as you said, pledging things and delivering things is not the same thing. And Ukraine still requires a lot more air defenses. Some of them that have been pledged have not been sent yet. And Kyiv is insistent that their allies stop delaying on those shipments.
Right. Oscar, thank you for this recap and for speaking with me. The first week of September saw one of the deadliest Russian attacks on Ukraine. President Zelenskyy met with Allied Defense Minister at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where he once again pushed for permission to use long-range weapons on Russian territory.
A wave of Russian attacks struck Kyiv on Monday, once again hitting civilian targets.
I think it was done on purpose. It's a university facility, and everyone knows that students are arriving for classes. Doing things like this is illegal. They hit Ohmady Children's Hospital and said that military personnel were stationed there. Is this a military facility here? It's simply horrible. My hands are still shaking.
On the same day, Russian missiles fell on Kharkiv, injuring 13 people. More than 300 attacks were reported across the Zaporizhia region, killing 2 people and injuring 2 more. Russia also attacked railway infrastructure and an energy facility in the northern region of Chernihiv. The deadliest attack took place on Tuesday. More than 50 people were killed and nearly 300 were injured in a missile strike on the city of Poltava. The attack was carried out with 2 ballistic missiles, targeting the Military Institute of Communications.
We thought it was somewhere in our house. We got ready to go out and realized that it was the Communications Institute. On this side, all the windows were smashed in the entrance and in the neighbors' houses.
On Wednesday, Russian missiles fell on Lviv, widely considered one of the safest cities in the country. 7 people were killed in the strike and about 40 were injured. The attack destroyed some of the city's bespoke architecture, prompting Polish PM Donald Tusk to pledge that Poland would help with the restoration efforts.
Lviv needs help. The Russians targeted the city's center. They destroyed many old and antique apartment buildings. Poland is ready to help with their reconstruction.
Russian forces also targeted the Lviv region on Thursday. A fire broke out in the village of Muranove, west of Lviv, after Ukrainian defense forces shot down a Russian drone. Kyiv hopes that long-range strikes against Russian air bases could reduce the intensity of attacks on Ukrainian cities. President Zelenskyy continues to call on Western allies to grant Kyiv permission to use their weapons on Russian territory.
We need to have this long-range capability not only on the occupied territory of Ukraine, but also on the Russian territory. Yes, so that Russia is motivated to seek peace.
Kyiv's allies, however, remain hesitant.
And now to discuss the latest developments on the ground, joining me is Colonel retired Ray Wójcik, former Army Attaché, U.S. Embassy in Warsaw. Hello, sir. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So let me start by asking you about the Kursk offensive. It started exactly a month ago. Then the Russian attacks followed. Do you think it is a response to the offensive itself?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, clearly, Putin has on his mind to punish Ukraine as much as possible, and anything perceived as, out of character for what the war has looked like so far, like this cross-border attack by the Ukrainians, significant terrain seized, would make Putin angry. But, Putin, as much as we think he's 10 feet tall in the war, he's not. And he has a limited amount of assets, too. So when he does these large barrages, he has to sequence them at certain times. And so he picked now. And it looks like, because the predictions, even before the Kursk offensive, was that he was going to be stepping up these kinds of attacks against infrastructure and terrorizing civilians until the winter.
Right. And speaking of winter, do you think that this will slow down what's happening in the trenches? And isn't this moment a crucial moment in the war? Because this, what some people are saying, this is why Zelenskyy is in Ramstein, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the maneuver traditionally, or basically the maneuver is slowed down by the weather in the winter. We've seen that in the last couple of years, but we know that from historical battles in the area. And we should underline, just getting back to Kursk for 1 minute, if we come back later, that this is the most significant World War II battle in the Soviet, the Russian history during the war. So for the fact that the Ukrainians have now seized a large part of the Kursk Oblast, is really a slap in the face of Putin. So getting back to the revenge kind of point. But yes, Putin, just like in previous winters, he wants to hurt the Ukrainian people as much as possible. And that's why he's going to start attacking more and more the civilian infrastructure and try to bring Ukraine to its knees.
Right, so you're saying that the Kursk offensive is a slap in the face of Vladimir Putin. But it's not all about the optics, right? It's also about the practical side. Mm-hmm. So I guess the Ukrainian forces were supposed to stop the Russian advance towards Pokrovsk. Mm-hmm. And so do you think that this offensive has been working? Is it accomplishing the goal?
Mm-hmm. If that's the main goal, it has had some limited success at doing that because the Russians are definitely slowed in attacking that area. But if you think about what's happened before at other cities in the Donbass, and especially in Donetsk, where Bakhmut, where the Russians literally took months small-level unit engagements, maneuver, and then these grinding assaults against the Ukrainians. That's probably going to be the same situation when they get to Pokrovsk. When they do that, we're going to see what the results really are of this attack, cross-border attack in Kursk. How much did they weaken the Russian advance, and or how much the Ukrainians had to commit to Kursk, or may have to still commit to Kursk to hold it, that they may need to be fighting back in Donetsk. So there's a little give and take on both sides what's going to happen because of this cross-border attack.
It's good that you mentioned Bakhmut, because it did become at some point a true meat grinder, right? It was a very heavy cost of fighting there. So do you think it was worth it? And could a similar thing happen with Pokrovsk or perhaps with Kursk?
Yeah, I think we need to look back at when you think about 10 years ago, we're at the 10-year anniversary of the war. Russia, with all the advantages in this campaign against Ukraine from 2014, is only holding on sort of barely to 20% of Ukraine. So all the plans and the vision of Putin in 2022 to take on all of Ukraine have been really completely washed away. So they are making limited advances, and at the pace they're going, the expert predictions are it would take years at the pace that the Russians are moving now to get to Kyiv. So they'll never get to Kyiv. The Ukrainians have shown they will always defend Kharkiv. So making these limited advances in the Donetsk, these are Pyrrhic victories for Russia to say, oh, yeah, we got this province. But that's not going to defeat the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are holding as best they can in the Donbass, and they will continue to do that. And then they've opened up another front against the Russians to cause them to have to commit forces somewhere. And they may do that in other places. So the Ukrainians have a lot up their sleeve, but it all depends on us. and our willingness to help them.
Right, but we've just been discussing the delays in the deliveries of weapons. So why are they happening, and sort of can we do something to sort of fast forward with the aid?
So 2 points. President Zelenskyy, just at the Ramstein group, this group of ministers of defense from Europe and around the world, made another plea again for these air defense systems that were committed to during the DC NATO summit. And most of them have not arrived yet. So that's really putting Ukraine in the hurt box. And it's a dual problem, because not only do you have weak air defense, and the F-16s are just coming online, that's a key part of the air defense. Everybody thinks the F-16s will go on immediate attack all over. They're part of the basic air defense system once they get integrated. But the other part is the fact that we've limited the ability of the Ukrainians. We tied their hand, one hand behind their back, to fire across the border with long-range system, our system, and the Germans won't even provide Taurus, another long-range system. So there's two key systems out there that we could fix right now. Give them the ability to fire ATACMS at the max range, and the Germans to give them Taurus systems, which can be air-launched to ground even farther than ATACMS. And this is part of the air defense problem, because there's lots of targets. The estimate is 200 to 250 targets within range right now of long-range ATACMS, and we haven't given them permission.
Right. So perhaps...
So it's not just supply. I'm sorry, it's both supply and permission.
Right, but do you think that this could potentially lead to a breakthrough, or is that still not enough? Because I believe that Lloyd Austin's argument is that it would still not lead to Ukrainian victory, right? It would still not be decisive in this.
The decisive moment comes when the United States president, either now or I hope it's soon, or by the next election, says we want Ukraine to win. We want Russia to be defeated. And so far we have not made that clear to Ukrainians, to the West, and to Russia. And deterrence has not been reestablished with Russia. Once we make that decision, all the policies can fall underneath that to fully support Ukraine. And these policy problems of not giving them permission, slowly giving them new complex weapon systems, all those policy decisions would be different if we had decided clearly 2 years ago, we want Ukraine to win, instead of like, we want them to hang on, we're there as long as it takes. That makes no sense. We have to help Ukraine win, and we have to say it and then act like it.
Right, and speaking of a potential peace deal, I believe that Volodymyr Zelenskyy has hinted at the fact that the Kursk offensive could help at the negotiating table. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think so, for sure. And he has said, actually, in his victory plan that he wants to relay both to President Biden, to both potential future presidents, Kamala Harris and President Trump. He wants to convey what those steps are. And he says the first step was the Kursk offensive, basically to seize territory, to have something to push back against the Russians at the negotiating table, and to boost the morale. I think more importantly, it's boosted the morale of the Ukrainian people.
Right, and speaking of the U.S., do you think that there will be a change in U.S. policy towards Ukraine following the November elections?
I hope not. I hope we do too. Well, actually, going back to my earlier point, I hope so. I hope that the change will be a decisive decision that we want Ukraine to win. If we don't do it, President Biden doesn't do it before the election, then I hope for sure whoever becomes president makes it clear for Putin to back off. We're standing with Ukraine, and we want Ukraine to win. That's the change. There has to be a change.
Ray Wójcik, thank you, sir, for being with us.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated.
Thanks, Sally.
And now turning to another topic, as nearly a third of Ukraine's cabinet has resigned in the biggest government shakeup since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. So let's take a look.
The Ukrainian government has approved Andriy Sybiha as the country's new foreign minister. A former diplomat at the Ukrainian embassy in Poland, Sybiha has also served as deputy head of the office of the president and first deputy foreign minister. Sybiha is replacing Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's most recognizable politician after Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
His resignation was long expected. He's set to become ambassador in one of the G7 countries. He asked for it. This change is not a result of of criticism or President Zelensky's disappointment.
Experts believe that it is unlikely that this nomination could bring a major shift in Ukraine's foreign policy strategy.
When it comes to Ukraine's position in the world, it will be a sort of continuation of the politics of Kuleba because he was his deputy for a very long time.
Herman Smetanin, CEO of a key manufacturer of military hardware, Ukroboronprom, has been appointed Strategic Industries Minister in charge of domestic arms production, a post of paramount importance in light of the ongoing war. Oleksiy Kuleba, who previously served as deputy head of the president's office, has been appointed as deputy prime minister in charge of reconstruction, regions and infrastructure. Olha Stefanishina has kept the post of Deputy Prime Minister in charge of European integration and has also been appointed Justice Minister.
The government has been replaced. I am grateful to the parliament for supporting the respective candidates. It is very important that government institutions work as actively as possible, even more actively than they did before.
The changes in the cabinet were already expected to take place in June, but were delayed by the complicated procedure required to dismiss ministers.
The military situation dictates what needs to happen on the political level, and of course the big picture here is that we're approaching the US election.
Zelensky's opponents are criticizing the reshuffle as a power grab aiming to stuff important positions with loyalists. Zelensky's official term in office ended in May, but due to Ukraine being under martial law, presidential elections have been postponed.
And to discuss this very issue, we have Mark Toff, national security and foreign policy expert, joining us right now. Hello, sir.
Sally, great to see you. Glad to be back on Ukraine this week.
So let me start by asking you about the reshuffle. It is a major shakeup. The war is still going on. Some even say that it's a pivotal moment in the war. So why now?
I think the answer to that question is the United Nations General Assembly meeting next week. Zelensky needs to change the equation. As your previous guest, Colonel Wojcik, was saying, we need to transition from defending for as long as it takes into a winning strategy. And Zelensky's determined to get that message across. And by visibly shaking up his team, one that in many regards was well respected across Europe and in Washington, he's sending a message that is not going to be business as usual. And so, notably, the foreign minister shakeup probably was the biggest change of all, and that was significant because he's well liked both in Brussels and Washington and across NATO member states. So Zelensky, I think, is saying, look, the time for getting to a winning message is now, and I'm going to shake up my cabinet so that there's fresh people, fresh energy that is taking that message to our allies across Europe and into Washington.
Right, and the Ramstein meeting he is attending himself, right? Perhaps he's also trying to send a message. So what he is trying to accomplish, in your view, that he's there in person?
Right. I think what Zelensky is trying to do is to lay the groundwork for how Ukraine wins. There's not been a clear articulation at this point from Washington, or for that matter, from Brussels, how Ukraine wins. We have a lot of how to play this war out into perpetuity, but no decisive way to bring it to an end. Defending as long as it takes means more and more Ukrainians die, more and more money gets spent, and nothing really gets resolved. And so what Zelensky is trying to do is to say, both at Ramstein and then subsequently what he'll probably be saying next week in New York, is that, look, there's got to be four parts to this. I've taken the first initiative. He views Kursk as that first part of his four-point plan to win. By taking Kursk, he thinks he's got a key that can unlock a lot of different doors, ultimately a door even at the negotiation tables towards the end of the war. But it can also unlock potential other movements across Ukraine, including, for instance, in Crimea or further in Donetsk, dependent upon how Ukraine wants to operate or the EFU decides to move forward. Secondly, he wants to get a bigger commitment from a weapons and munitions standpoint, to not just in terms of what is being provided. They've got ATACMS, they have certain systems, but they're not coming online quick enough, and they're not meeting the need that Ukraine is faced with, which is to be able to strike deeper into Russian territory to mitigate against these attacks on their civilian targets, especially those energy targets ahead of the coming winter. And then on a third basis, he wants more economic sanctions. He wants to take this fight more to stop the flow of oil, if possible, that's still coming from Russia to Europe, and the returning funds accordingly. And he also wants to see more sanctions. There's just too many loopholes. Too many American companies are still operating in Moscow, which is outrageous. And so the fourth one he's kind of kept as a secret. That's one that he's held close to his vest, and presumably we'll get to know more about that come next Tuesday or Wednesday when he's in New York.
Right, but the plan it was to be shared not only with President Biden, but also with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, presidential candidates. So do you think there will be a change in the U.S. policy after the November vote? Is it even possible?
It really depends on who wins in terms of what that change might look like. But from my perspective, purely as a national security and military type analyst, there has to be a change. You can't keep fighting this war in this manner. It's doing no one any favors. It's not helping Ukraine in the long run to see its soldiers and its men and women in terms of civilians die. It's not helping Poland or the Baltic states or anyone in Eastern Europe to see this war continue, infinitum. There has to be a conclusion to it. And so, for instance, if Harris wins, I'm hopeful that she'll lean into, with her new national security team, presumably led by Philip Gordon, into more of a winning strategy, more of a win-now strategy, as opposed to this piecemeal strategy of survive to fight another day that's been coming out of the Biden administration and Jake Sullivan. With respect to Trump, were he to win, we just don't know yet. I don't have a clear enough picture of who his entire team would be in terms of the different plans that have been floated around him by former members of his administration, the past administration, to get a clear sense of what he wants to do. What is clear is he's just not going to be able to wave a wand. He's not going to be able to declare this war over on day one and somehow magically bring it to an end. It's going to take military victories on the battlefield to do that, but it's also going to take giving Ukraine a stronger hand by committing and greenlighting more munitions and weapon systems that they need. And most importantly, across all of those realms, taking off the handcuffs, the restrictions of their use, so that Ukraine can use them to maneuver against, on the battlefield, against Russia wherever they need to. Right now, they're just too limiting.
Right, and so what does the change of foreign minister, as it is happening in case of Ukraine with Andriy Sybiha, mean for a country at war? What kind of consequences could that have?
Sally, there's really two answers to that right now if we're to listen to some of the Ukrainians themselves. Some Ukrainians are concerned that it means a concentration of power under Zelenskyy. I get that. No one wants to see oligarchs replacing oligarchs that were ousted as part of the Freedom Revolution. So I get that concern. I also get the concern, actually there's a third. I get the concern coming out of Brussels that the previous foreign minister, Kubala, was a well-known entity. He was well-liked and well-regarded, and he certainly made Ukraine's case well for winning. But I think in this time of war, what's important for both Ukraine to consider internally, but also its allies in NATO and in Washington, is to remember that Zelenskyy remains the face of Ukraine. He remains the face of Ukraine not just in the country, but he remains the face of Ukraine globally, and he's the one that can best make its case. And for that reason, it's important for us now to rally behind his new choice in foreign minister and clearly kind of get behind him and step back and say, okay, what's the message that he wants to send with this new foreign minister? I think I suspect it's going to be one of greater urgency, that the time for the wait and see kind of attitudes towards weapon systems and the like, we'll analyze this, we'll analyze that to death, are over. Zelenskyy wants to accelerate the timeline. He wants to bend the curve forward so that he can get to a winning situation in Ukraine in their war against Russia.
So switching gears a little bit, let me ask you about what's happening on the ground in a military sense, since you're an expert on that, and sort of how do you gauge the Kursk offensive? Is it effective?
Yeah, Sally, it's an important question. There's basically four main theaters going on right now. You've got Kursk, which is an offensive theater. It's where Ukraine is taking the fight and they're taking it to Russia. You've got the deep fight in Crimea, where they continue to set conditions, destroying air defense systems, trying to take out key sites like bridges, command and control centers, munition depots, and the like. You've also got the deep fight that's going on inside of Russia, proper as far away as Moscow. And that's been evidenced by the recent taking out of the oil refinery in Moscow, as well as two gas-powered energy plants. And so there's that deep fight. And then you've got what I would call kind of the incremental fight that's happening in the Donbass, what we're seeing in and around Bakhmut, what we're seeing headed towards Pokrovsk, and the like. And so from Kursk's standpoint, I think what we're looking at this point, based on the latest data, is that Ukraine continues marginally to increase its foothold in that region. It's still making gains. There's reports that their special operation forces are operating across the Siem River, which is a good thing. They're able to continue taking out Russian attempts to throw pontoon bridges back across that river, because if you remember early on in the Kursk offensive, Ukraine took out many of those bridges coming from Russia into the Kursk Oblast. And so that's good. So they continue to consolidate, and they continue to draw. As many as 60,000 Russian troops now are reported to have been drawn into the area to create defensive lines around it. So in my mind, I know there's been some hand-wringing, certainly in a publication that I write for in Washington, D.C., The Hill. There's been some questioning about whether or not it's a failure. I don't think that it is. I think Kursk is doing exactly what Zelenskyy intended it to achieve, and I think it's opening up those opportunities elsewhere. Now, it does real quickly, I might add. It comes at a price, obviously, and war is about choices. You have to make a choice about where you deploy most of your forces. And right now in the Donbass, it means that the Donbass is fighting with a little bit less. But it does appear, based on the latest reports, that Ukraine has continued to stabilize that area. The advancement by Russian troops is very incremental, very slow. And I'm not as concerned about it as many are in the immediate sense. I'm confident in the AFU's ability to reposition forces if needed to shore up that area. So all in all, I think Ukraine's in the driver's seat right now. They just need more help. They need more oomph in the engine, and that's got to come from Washington and Brussels.
Right, but even if that help is pledged yet again, the time frame on deliveries is quite lengthy. It appears to be quite lengthy. So do you think that even if Zelenskyy gets the promises, will he manage to use these weapons ahead of winter? Because winter is around the corner.
Yeah, I think we talk about these weapons sometimes just in the defensive sense, what they can do to defend Ukrainian civilians. But a lot of these weapons are key for what we, in terms of people that analyze the battlefield, talk about maneuver. They're to create space, and that's really what Ukraine's not been able to do, except in Kursk. They've done that magnificently in Kursk. You saw the result of them being able to create space to maneuver, to actually conduct combined arms warfare, and it's worked masterfully. They've not been able to do that in the Donbass or southward towards Crimea. And so a lot of these weapons can do that. The further that you can interdict Russian forces behind the front lines, then you start to create that space for that breakthrough. And so whether those weapon systems come online enough for a winter offensive, I doubt it. It's possible that there could be some marginal ones, but it's probably something that's slated more towards a spring offensive next year before they'll come into full force. But they need to get done. Right now, we're still talking about it. Right now, the White House is still analyzing it. And that's crazy. There's no reason in the world not to give Ukraine these systems and not to greenlight their use to do that.
And with that statement, we conclude our talk. Thank you, Mark Toff, national security and foreign policy expert. Much appreciated.
Always appreciate it. Thank you, Sally.
And with this, we conclude Ukraine This Week. Thank you for watching, and please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.